All too often, the very principles of sport are undermined by the behaviour of select groups of fans, ladies and gentlemen. All too often, fans like those of Celtic or Rangers bring the game into disrepute by chanting sectarianist chants. All too often, fans of football in Italy come out with flares and cause violence in the cities, and the same thing happened in Canada following the Vancouver's elimination from the final series of the inline hockey league there. What we say on side proposition is the best way to prevent that behaviour from happening in the first place is to actually impose fines, to impose penalties on, and I'm going to talk more about what these are, on the clubs themselves. But moreover, we're going to tell you why it is justifiable that we also punish the clubs as well as the fans. And so what we're going to what we're talking about today is we're taking action against those fans and against clubs who have fans, who take actions like violence, like rioting, like racism, general hooliganism, which brings the game into disrepute. And we would punish the club whose fans belong to, the club who the fans belong to would be punished by fines. They'd be punished by things like point deductions. They'd be punished like being forced to play their next games behind closed doors. And the club and clubs and we like the level of these punishments would be dependent upon the recurrence of these actions. It would be dependent on things like whether or not the club did try to take preventative measures. We note that these sort of punishments happen at the moment when the club takes direct action itself. So like when Portsmouth failed to actually manage their finances properly, that meant they had a points deduction in the English Premier League, in the English Premier Football League. But what we say is that should extend to actions that their fans take. And what we and the way that we do this is have an international tribunal set up to determine the level of the behaviour that is taken and the punishments which should be handed out to the clubs. And if the behaviour continued, obviously the punishments would get worse and worse. So who do we stand for on Team New Zealand today? We stand for the fans who are passionate about sport, but they don't allow that passion...
Point of information,
No,
sir.
thanks. We don't, the fans that don't allow that passion to translate into violence. We stand for the fans who like to enjoy sport in the ways that the vast majority of fans do, but the people we don't stand for are the fans...
Point of information.
No thanks. The fans of River Plate FC in Argentina, who storms the pitch after their final match of the season and started acts of violence. They let off flares. We don't stand for the fans of Celtic and Rangers, as I talked about, that actually chant sectarianism, chants and create violence within society. And so what we say today is this policy will be good, and we're going to tell you why that is true in 5 main points. No thanks. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how this will improve the behaviour of fans. Secondly, how this policy will incentivise greater preventative measures by clubs. And finally, why it's also fair to hold clubs accountable as well as fans. What Thomas is going to talk to you about is how allowing this behaviour to continue undermines the principles of sport and the effects of the behaviour of fans on society. No thanks. So, moving on to my first point. We think the very reason that fans riot is because of their passion for the team. But what we say is that there are fans who are passionate, and then there are fans who allow that passion to translate into violence, to translate into racism, to translate into sectarianism. And we say the broad point here is that these are the fans who love their club so much that they're prepared to risk personal punishment. And so what we say is by imposing punishment on the clubs as well, you make them take their actions into account far more because of the fact that they love their club so much. They don't want their club to have a points deduction. They don't want to not be able to watch the next home game because it has to be behind closed doors. And so what we say is this means fans of clubs like Rangers and Celtic are less likely to do these chants because that would mean that there's less money for the club, because that would mean their club might lose points, so they have less of an advantage over their rivals. Clearly, these are the fans who don't want that at all. The second thing we'd say is that there are currently fans who think they can get away with it, because it's very hard to determine which individual fan yelled out something racist when there's a crowd of 50 or even 100,000 people in the stadium. And that means that fans think they can get away with it. Now they know everyone's going to be punished, which means they're less likely to engage in these actions. Finally, we say the crowd and pack mentality we see in many of these actions is removed. Because even if one fan starts trying to sing a sectarian song or start a fight or pulls a flare out of their bag, the rest of the fans are likely to try and prevent that. They're likely to tell them not to because it will hurt the club. They're likely to alert security to this danger and not join in themselves, which we see as a big problem under the current system. Broadly, they're not going to be a passive observer and allow these things to happen. We point to the example of River Plate in Argentina. Fans wouldn't have been willing to storm onto the pitch because they would have known that would have harmed their club further the next season. We'd also point to the example of the Indian and Pakistan cricket teams and the fans of those cricket teams. They'd be less likely to engage in violence after the matches. They'd be less likely to start fights in the crowds because they know that would punish the teams that they love so much. Moving on to my second point, how this will incentivise greater preventative measures for clubs. Because we say a huge part of violence, I'll take you in a moment, a huge part of the violence and hooliganism is clubs failing to take action. And I'm going to tell you why this would change that behaviour after I take this point.
Often fans hold racist insults at players on their own team. Does it make sense to punish these players again by docking points for the team they play for?
No, well, we're talking about, the broad principle here is that we are punishing the entire club. We're punishing the fans themselves, who, the current incentives about because fans currently aren't reacting to personal incentives to stop them from taking that behaviour, we're saying that the entire club will be hurt as a result of their behaviour. That means that we know, because they love the club so much, they're more likely to react to those punishments. And that was what my entire first point was about, in case you weren't listening. So, moving on to my second substantive again. We say the clubs, often clubs don't, the reason that they don't take action is because they might not want to lose money. Because, the reason that they will start taking action, is because they don't want to lose money. They don't want to lose points. Like he just told you that they wouldn't want that to happen. And so that means they're going to react to a disincentive of punishment. So we say there's a huge amount that clubs can do in order to stop this type of behaviour. This means they can do things, they're more likely to do things like greater policing, like checking bags more thoroughly at the entrance, like having more security guards around the pitch to watch out for violence, like monitoring message boards to ensure that there's not actually racism going on their club message boards on their own websites, which they don't monitor at the moment. So we say the clubs are more likely to take these measures if they know that they will be hurt by monetary incentives or by points incentives, and so we think that that improves the measures that they take. Finally, we say it's fair to hold clubs accountable because of that very fact. Because when clubs fail to take action, because it might cost them too much to have more security guards on the ground, because they think it might alienate fans, we say that's not good enough, and they will start to take it into account under the system. We say they must start to take into account the effects that those fans are having on wider society. Thomas is going to talk more about that. But also we say my previous 2 points are justification enough. They're principled justification enough, because we eliminate this hooliganism which is plaguing sport at the moment, which we think is so terrible. And it's because of that hooliganism that Team New Zealand is so very proud to propose.
For his speech, and I now call upon Benjamin to open the case for the opposition.
We also stand against racism and hooliganism in sport, in case they thought we were one of those racist and hooliganist fans. But we disagree that punishing sports teams for the poor behavior of their fans is the right way to quell those problems. Today, we stand for an established model of regulation for sports teams that's already followed in most jurisdictions worldwide. This covers 3 aspects: policing, safety, and crowd control. Examples of such regulations include requiring clubs to expel fans who have disrupted the field of play, getting rid of fans who chant racist slogans, having appropriate fire escapes, and metal detectors to confiscate dangerous items. Such policies have been adopted successfully in the English Premier League in Britain, as well as the National Football League in the United States. And thus our model does have alternatives to deal with the precise problems they talked about, and without resulting in an unfair collective punishment of all fans. No thank you. If sports teams don't abide by the rules we suggest, they should be punished for breaking those precise rules, and if sports teams follow all the rules but their fans still demonstrate poor behaviour, we're not going to hold them legally culpable, but individual fans will still be punished. No thank you. Before I move to the positive argumentation, there are a few things we need to address in this debate, and I'm going to do this through two questions. First, with regard to the model they've presented, and second, with regard to the practical elements they've talked about. So let's look first, no thank you, at the model. And here, they gave this rather interesting analogy to Portsmouth and insolvency. We think, no thank you, that analogy doesn't hold at all, because clubs are responsible, we grant, no thank you, for their financial records and their financial status. But we say they can't be responsible for their fans. Nobody can decide to tell you that you want to pick up a Man United jersey, for example, no thank you, or tell you to reject. Clubs don't have that level of control. Then their policy involves this idea of docking points of clubs where fans demonstrate poor racist behaviour. All they said was, well, we stand for the broad principle in response to a point of information we gave. That amounts to no response when players have suffered the racist abuse and now suffer damaged career prospects as well, a point I'm going to further develop in my substantive. We challenge them to give us a proper response. So that's the first issue dealt with. Now let's look at the practical aspect of the issue. No thank you. Well, they came up from the beginning of the debate, and it was quite telling that they said it's select groups of fans who are doing this. It's select groups, and yet they want to make the whole club, as well as all passionate, loving fans they want to defend, also punished. That's simply ridiculous. And now I'm going to hit out all three reasons they gave in support of their case. They first talked about improving fan behaviour. No thank you, listen to this. My second substantive is going to hit that further, but what I'm going to say now is that fans who are racist and hooligans, no thank you, don't even care about the team. They prefer an idealized image of a team as racially pure, for example, and they don't find it rational to think about the possible legal consequences when they're doing such things. So we don't see how their behaviour is going to change. But you disagree.
Yes, I do disagree. If you can remove all of those, like the select group of hooligan fans who are provoking all of the violence throughout the rest of the club, then don't you think that A, the violence is actually incredibly decreased, but B, you can actually punish those fans who are responsible for most of the violence?
Sir, that precisely neglects the analysis I've just made. I've told you two reasons why fans who are racist and hooligans won't respond to this, because they're not rational when they think about doing these things, and in fact, they place their racist images of the club above the club's performance in the first place. Then let's now deal with this argument, no thank you, that it's hard to tell which fans were racist. Let's first point out there's a contradiction with a later argument they raised, where they said that clubs can essentially improve their security detection measures and find out who these people are. That's simply ridiculous. But in the second place, we say we can already tell who these people are. We've seen the successful punishment of thousands of individuals in the British riots which just occurred last week. Even if we're not able to do it all the time, we say the perverse incentive that's generated for fans to disguise as fans of other clubs which they hate is going to make it even worse in their situation. And my second speaker is going to further that argument. No thank you. So all their examples about Celtic and Rangers and the Pakistani and Indian cricket teams hit out. Let's now look at this preventative measures argument they raised. We say we already deal with these preventative measures, as we've shown in the model. No thank you. And in fact, clubs can't be responsible for solving the problem with regard to their fans. And on their final point about club accountability, I'm going to say first, it's not a real point. It's in fact just the last link of their final argument. So if we've taken out the previous analysis, we've taken out all three reasons. So let's now talk about my arguments. I'm going to first explain, no thank you, why it's unfair to teams, then look at why it's unfair to fans, and my second speaker is going to look at why it perversely incentivizes further fan misbehavior. We stand on the base principle that it's unfair and ineffective. No thank you. Let's look now at why it's unfair for teams. Our thesis is that teams shouldn't be held legally culpable for the poor behavior of their fans because they are innocent of wrongdoing. Now, to determine whether someone's guilty of a crime, there are two conditions we must fulfill. First, actus rea, did someone commit the crime? Second, no, thank you, mens rea, did they intend to commit the crime? When poor behavior of sports fans is concerned, sports teams aren't liable on either criteria. First, sports teams don't decide to commit such poor behavior. In fact, they often act to discourage, no thank you, such racist behavior, as we've seen with most English clubs having signed up to such campaigns as Show Racism, the Red Card, Since most sports teams already follow the regulations we prescribe, no thank you, we think no crime of omission is committed by sports teams. Thus, they haven't committed the poor behaviour. But even so, we argue that sports teams don't decide to commit such poor behaviour, because as I explained just now, they can't even decide who their fans are. In the second place, sports teams want to protect their reputation, and most fans don't want to be linked, no thank you, to a racist or hooliganist image. The third reason is that sports teams don't have an incentive to do this because it means losing talent from racial minorities. We've seen this with Mario Balotelli, a talented striker who left the club Inter Milan due to racist abuse that he suffered there. Since sports teams don't decide to commit poor behaviour, mens rea isn't fulfilled either, and furthermore, double jeopardy is inflicted on players who are often the targets of racist abuse. When Juventus got points docked for racial abuse hurled at players, for instance, African players suffered abuse which damaged their career prospects. Thus, poor behaviour by sports fans doesn't mean sports teams should be penalised. Let's look now at why it's unfair to fans. Here, the thrust of our argument is that collective punishment hurts the innocent, well-behaved fans. Now, if we're going to adopt their policy, fans who are well-behaved will be hurt too, because the whole fan base is now tarred with the same brush of racism and hooliganism, not just the one or two people who decided to do it. The impact reverberates throughout the entire group, not just the select group of people they wanted to talk about. In fact, official fan clubs are already working to quell the racism and the violence, as we've seen at Manchester United, for example. But in any case, the racists and hooligans whom Proposition wants to target won't respond to their policy, because they already prioritize the image, as I explained just now, of their teams as racially pure over their exact performance. Players and managers of Celtic and Rangers have kept trying to tell their supporters to stop the racism because it hurts their performance on the field. Fans still carried on. Death threats being laid to their own manager of Rangers, Neil Warnock, because of the fact that he was Protestant. In any case, we argued already that fans often hurl such racist and offensive abuse in the heat of the moment. They're not thinking rationally. Such legal penalties don't matter. Thus, punishing sports teams for the poor behaviour of their fans is unfair to most fans who didn't do anything. It's unfair because it doesn't stop abuse they tried to stop. And it's unfair to sports teams who didn't do anything at all. If we want sport to be championed, don't hurt players.
I thank the first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case of the proposition, I call upon Thomas.
Despite the very clear analysis James brought out to you at first, we've had no response to how this alters the incentives on fans. We think that when you love a football club so much that you're prepared to commit acts of violence for it, you're not going to want to screw it over by actually ensuring it's punished. We think this doesn't stand up, improves fan behaviour, ensures responsibility of clubs. This is why we are proud to propose. I'm going to look at two substantive points today. Firstly, how the status quo undermines sport, and secondly, the wider effects on society. But firstly, I'm going to look at two areas of rebuttal. So firstly, we've had this idea about how this is really bad because it's collective punishment and it punishes fans. We have a few responses to this. Firstly, we think that we already recognise that we do this in a number of other ways. For example, if certain individuals in a company are acting in a bad manner and breaking the law, we actually fine the company. We see that we already do this, even though that may affect other individuals in the company that didn't make that decision. Also, we think that teams are responsible for the action of their fans. For example, we think that there's a clear correlation between supplying shots of vodka at Dundee prices in your home stadium and violence that is then committed later on. No, thank you. Additionally, we think that this is just analogous to negligence. The fact that when clubs fail to take these actions, then they should be liable for the results of that. And we think that clubs will also want to reduce the punishment and reduce their culpability by taking these steps, because we recognise that when clubs take these steps and actually try and prevent it, naturally they're less culpable and the punishment should be less. So then we've had this idea that this is really bad for fans. Well, we think that the status quo is really bad for fans, where normal fans can't go along to a football game because they're scared of the violence and the intimidation of their own team. We think that we actually stop this violence and we allow the legitimate fans to better enjoy what should be a good game of football or whatever. So then the other issue they raised was, some fans make racist remarks to players of their own team. We think this was a bizarre issue to bring up and really wasn't a major issue. We think that generally when you make racist remarks, it's against players of the other team, the one that you don't like. So we think that we actually stop that sort of behaviour when we punish the opposing team. The players that do get racism hurled at them from the opposition don't get any vindication at the moment. Also, we think that in many ways the players are directly responsible for the action of their fans. For example, there's a water polo match between Russia and Hungary where the players started clawing each other and going hard at each other. And then this led to massive riots through the crowd. We think that the conduct of players on the field or indeed in the pool does directly lead to the fans behaving in certain ways. So the second area of rebuttal I'm going to look at is this idea of the incentives and the efficacy of this. So they've said that, we can already have regulations to ensure we have metal detectors and so on, but we actually think we need a strong incentive if clubs are going to do this. Additionally, we think that clubs are actually more likely when there's more risk to put in these devices. For example, the clubs that have the greatest problem are going to probably have the greatest security measures because they need that, rather than applying it indiscriminately where it's not needed. So the other thing they told you was that hooligans aren't rational. Well, we think that the thing with hooligans is they love their team so much that they want them to succeed. They're not going to pursue these actions and engage in hooliganism and riotous actions when they know that their team that they love so much, the whole reason they're doing this, is going to be punished in the end. So I now turn to my substantive material. No, thank you. Firstly, how this undermines sport. We think that the purpose of sport should be to unite people in cooperation and competition in what should be a high-class event. We think this is like we've heard the debating chairs tell us in 8 debates that the purpose is to encourage a very high level of exchange and communication between the two teams. We think that we should respect the purpose of sport in terms of creating competition and creating better outcomes that we want. Sorry, were you offering one?
Yeah. There's a quite clear difference between a company and a club. You can choose who you want to sell to if you're McDonald's. You can't choose who your fans are if you're Manchester United. How can you hold the clubs responsible?
We think you can clubs can screen their fans, and if they're constantly doing bad things, they're incentivized to lock them out and stop them coming to home games. They're incentivized to put in better security measures. They're incentivized to not sell cheap shots of vodka to fans. We think that this creates the incentives for clubs to deal with this sort of action. So we think that when you have so back to the substantive point about how to undermine sport, we think that when you have hooliganism and riotous behaviour encouraged and actually able to occur without any punishment, what it means is that it undermines the very purpose of sport. Just like having someone from New Zealand in the crowd participating in the main debate would undermine this. So we think that this undermines the entire sports situation when on the front cover of the paper you have a report about a riot rather than what it should be, a game between people of a high quality who are good quality players competing and doing their best. We also think that this undermines the effect of sporting role models. Like when you have children going along to a game and seeing people getting really drunk and then throwing beer cans onto the field at players. We think that this leads to undermining what sport should be about for kids, and it sets them a very bad example. That's not something we're prepared to stand for, and we think that by actively discouraging it, we create better outcomes. Secondly, to this next point about the wider effects on society. The first effect we see with this is teams are often split on quite sectarian values. For example, they're often based on nationality, as with national teams, race or religion, or indeed with class. So we see this in Scotland, where you had Celtic, which is essentially a Catholic club, and Rangers, which is a Protestant club. When you have this sort of violence that happens on the pitch, we think this creates a highly negative effect in leading to wider sectarian violence and wider riots that occur when they see that it's fine to attack members of the other team that they're so engaging in such vitriol against. We think that when we alter the incentives, we deal with the sectarian strife and stop this problem. We also see this with India and Pakistan, where you have a riot about a cricket game because India beat Pakistan, and then people in Pakistan then go and burn effigies of Indian prime ministers and the cricketers. We see that because it's so inextricably linked with politics, it leads to wider sectarian violence and wider strife. That's not something that we are prepared to stand for. We've also seen things like shopkeepers being targeted in India by Pakistani fans after these sort of games. Again, we think that when we alter the incentives and make sure that hooligans aren't going to punish their own clubs, we stop this, we stop the wider effects of this violence, and we lead to better outcomes. So, on Team New Zealand, we're prepared to stand for this because it alters the incentives and creates better outcomes for sport. New Zealand is proud to be fans of football. We're not proud to be fans of violence. That is why we are proud to propose.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case of the opposition, I call upon Ashish.
It's a very odd kind of justice Team New Zealand supports, isn't it? Because it's one of those really bizarre instances when we punish a majority for the actions of a minority. Worse, they don't even do anything to change the way the minority acts. I have three simple points of contention. Firstly, is what they're doing just? Because this is a point they seem very reluctant to talk about. Secondly, does it really change behaviour on the part of the fans and on the part of the teams? And last of all, does it really create a better image for sport? Firstly, is it just? They say, when there's embezzlement from people in a company, we punish the entire company. Firstly, no we don't, we punish the people within the company. That's the status quo. That wasn't even true in the first place, and if it was, we tell you, we don't stand for it. You can't just try to prove a principle by example like that. Secondly, they said, oh, that's negligence. There is a criteria for negligence, and there's a point where negligence stops being a reason for us punishing you. That is when a team has taken all reasonable measures it could have, no thank you, and yet this violence happens. This debate does not happen when teams fail to take up the measures both sides agree they should abide by. This debate happens, no thank you, when teams do in fact do these things. When teams put in metal detectors and tell their fans not to do this, and the fans still riot anyway. That's when the debate is located, because both teams agree that teams should be made to do these and should be punished anyway if they don't. We tell you often teams do take these actions, but violence happens anyway. It happened in La Liga, it happened in Serie A, in Spain. This is a very common form of violence, no thank you. Teams often take measures and it happens anyway. It's not fair to punish them. Thirdly, they talk about things teams are often directly responsible. No thank you, not now. They say teams often supply massive amounts of vodka at Dundee prices. Now, I'm very happy to have vodka at Dundee prices, guys. Don't mistake me, but in the status quo, we have regulations saying teams can't sell alcohol to their fans. No thank you. That's just one of the regulations teams are forced to take up. The question, once again, is the fact that they're trying to retreat into a space where they say, well, teams currently aren't doing anything, so we should punish them. But that's not where the debate is, as I've already pointed out. No thank you. Then we talked to you about this very important point about double jeopardy. And they basically said, oh, there is never any case where fans riot against their own team. No, it happens all the time. Samuel Eto'o got racist remarks hurled at him from his own team. Mario Balotelli and Thierry Henry all got insults hurled at them from their own fans who thought that it was wrong that people from races that they were from were playing in their own team. It's a very significant number of cases. It's disappointing they don't even want to talk about these. In many cases, furthermore, I'll take you in a moment, fans resort to violence when their own team loses and they're upset with the performance of their team. Like, that's another instance when the actions of the fans go against the interests of that team. That's another clear case of double jeopardy you don't want to talk about. Yes?
You say this punishes the vast majority of non-violent fans, but surely eliminating fights in the crowd helps the man who has supported Celtic FC his entire life but can't take his 5-year-old son to a game because of the current situation of the game.
Well, listen out for my rebuttal and my following point of contention, because I'm going to get to this strange point that currently fans who don't commit violence are afraid to go to matches because of the violence that might happen. Let's move back to the point about whether or not this is just. No, thank you. Last of all, they said, well, players misbehave and this causes misbehavior in their fans. Simple, just punish the player himself. That's a good enough incentive. On to the second issue, therefore. Do they really change behavior? No, thank you. We pointed out that many fans act in the heat of the moment and aren't rational. They accuse us of never dealing with the logic when we clearly talked about it, and they never in turn responded to the point that fans simply don't act rationally in the heat of the moment. Many of the people who commit violence, no thank you, don't go, I'm going to plan to commit violence later, and then go there and then commit that sort of violence. It happens in the heat of the moment when they see what their player or player from the other team is doing. So firstly, your incentives don't work in the first place. But then they talk about how we can screen fans and how teams can somehow choose their fans because every fan has like an identity card which you like give to someone at the entrance. Firstly, that's absurd. That's not a policy any team is going to use because teams tend to be happy with having a large number of fans. For you to now exclude fan membership to some very exclusive club is something no thank you, which is very unlikely to happen. And in any case, that's not what your original policy was. Now you're suddenly suggesting a massive change that teams must be forced to register and choose their fans. That's already an extremely dubious change. No thank you. Then on to this point about the fact that, you know what, fans will be scared to go along to matches. Firstly, as I said, that point is hung on the fact that you do change the behavior of those violent people in the first place. You don't, so all the bad things accrue on your side anyway. Secondly, that's simply not true. Many of the people who don't commit violence love their teams enough to go down and avoid that sort of violence in the very first place. That's what happens in the vast majority of circumstances. Last issue, therefore, is this good for sport? And this very nicely dovetails into my point of substantive about how their policy creates a perverse incentives that fans use to unfairly punish teams and which also destroys the image of sport as being something which ought to be integrated because, no thank you, that's something they also claim to stand for. We need to acknowledge that fans of certain teams often exploit the policy they talk about to sabotage other teams. How does this happen? No thank you. In the status quo, fans often go into opponents, dress in their opponent team's colours, sneak into their opponent's stadiums, and unfurl insulting banners. What the policy lets these people do, what lets Team New Zealand do, is to let the fans use this policy to hold and sabotage the teams that they dislike. Because that's what they are going to do. They're going to dress up in the opposing team's colours, go into the stadiums, and shout out those sorts of insults. Now they're going to have some sort of handy response about how, no, because the fans around them will stop it. Wait a minute, in the status quo, teams and fans already have every incentive to stop this sort of violence from happening. Benjamin gave you a very large list of reasons why no team in the world, nor any fan, want to be associated with violence. These are extremely strong incentives, because teams ride upon their popularity to gain funding, to gain merchandise, and also because, as decent human beings, they do not want to be the team which is always booed in every single match. Those are all large incentives we talked about, they never dealt with. We said no thank you. So even in the status quo, this sort of violence happens. Your logic about other fans stopping them is simply not going to apply, and you're not going to be able to stop this sort of sabotage from happening. We tell you that also damages the image of sport, because if you think it ought to be integrative, there's nothing less integrative than people exploiting a policy to drive wedges between teams and to cause these teams to come to even more discord. But there's a second way in which that policy is even more insidious, because you recognize that in many places around the world, sporting teams are bound up together with certain ethnic or regional identities that a certain group of fans subscribe to. They subscribe to ideas of racial purity, for instance, or a certain kind of regional identity. They don't subscribe to the club as it exists per se, but they believe in an idealized version of the club that they want to have there forever. So they're very happy to harm that club, even if it means, because it means, I apologize, that the club moves towards that vision they want to create. That's why in India, when the Royal Bengal Challengers tried to bring a Muslim in onto supported a team who was a Kashmiri, there were massive riots among the fans. What your policy lets these fans do is to hold such teams hostage by basically saying any kind of violence we create will result in you being punished. The exact same thing happens in places in Canada. Whenever ice hockey is played in Quebec, black players get insulted by the crowd, and teams that try to bring in black players are now going to be held hostage by their own fans who say, we will commit violence to force you to take away these players and to make your sport less integrated. So you're going to be destroying the sort of role models you create, no thank you, by creating a homogeneous team which cannot integrate and cannot promote the image of sport. What have I shown you? The policy is unjust, it doesn't change anything in the status quo. We are proud to stand in opposition.
I thank the second opposition speaker for his speech and now to continue the case for the proposition I call upon James.
I think the biggest problem with Singapore's case so far is that they haven't actually been living in the real world. And that when they talk about regulation, they don't realise that there are massive riots continuing to occur in almost all, or many UK football games. And when they talk about the fact that clubs can regulate, they actually don't recognise that there are clubs that are regulating right now, but that we're not punishing those clubs who are absolutely failing in their standards. So when Fulham's manager manages to sort out their fans and try to prevent all that sort of violence occurring, then we shouldn't that's clear evidence that there is a solution. But when the Rangers continue to fail their fans, then we need to bring justice to them and we need to prevent those sorts of problems continuing to occur. So what we've brought to you on Team New Zealand is a solution to a systemic problem that is just. And I'm going to deal with that now with that in mind. So firstly, I'm going to tell you why this policy leads to considerably better behaviour and how crucial that is among fans. And secondly, why Team New Zealand's system of club accountability combined with individual accountability is much fairer than Team Singapore's way of relying on just weak individual accountability that isn't working right now. So first, why it leads to considerably better behaviour. I'm going to look at this in terms of clubs, good fans, and bad fans. So firstly, clubs. Well, what we've had from the Singapore team is an approach that is really in denial. So they've ignored the reality that there are all these ongoing problems. They've just said that the UK and the US have good regulation systems, but they haven't recognised the massive riots that are occurring every single Saturday night. But secondly, we think in terms of this regulation point, it's quite clear that we don't currently have inspectors that go through and keep an eye on all the problems. So the fact is, when the riots actually do break up now, there is a clear indication that something's going wrong with that club every Saturday. That's something that we need to solve. And what we gave you on Team New Zealand, moreover, though, was actually proper analysis about this. So we told you that currently there are incentives that act on clubs not to take a stand. So they put off their fans by being too confrontational to them. They lose publicity. They lose dollars. That means that clubs currently, right now, aren't taking a stand on their fans. What we do on Team New Zealand is we end that reality. So what we do is we create strong incentives for the clubs to avoid losing points and losing money. So when there are shareholders that the clubs are accountable to start realising that their own club is going to be losing points in the league table and have to pay a lot of money, then they take serious action. So they improve their public relations, they change the culture, they try to soften the club rhetoric and make the fans more compromising, and they improve on their physical security as well. So they check the bags better and they don't serve alcohol to drunk, red-faced customers or sell it in they sell it in plastic bottles as opposed to glass bottles. Those are the things that clubs will begin to do under our system that aren't happening under Singapore's system. So now we're talking about good fans. So on Singapore's side, what we have is a system where good fans know they won't be caught if they start rioting. So we think the majority wouldn't start rioting. But what happens is when somebody provokes a riot in the crowd right now, and you have only a 1 in 1,000 chance of actually being caught, you start engaging in mass riots. On Team New Zealand's side, though, you actually suddenly know that the threat for you continuing that rioting is you won't be able to watch any more games because they're going to be suddenly behind closed doors. That's a really strong incentive for somebody, and we think that the fact that the Serbian football team, when they actually had to start playing their qualifiers behind closed doors because of fans' riotings, and their better behaviour was immediately incentivised, they improved on their behaviour, shows that it will be much better. So then let's talk about the select group of fans that perhaps don't care about the team. So yes, they provoke the riots right now, but the big thing that we have on Team New Zealand's side is that the majority doesn't suddenly join into that now, because they know that there's a massive disincentive, because their own club is going to be compromised, and they're not going to be able to watch games right now.
Point of information.
What we heard from their side then was they fell back on, well, these fans are irrational, so they're going to continue to provoke these sorts of riots. This was just an assertion. So if you're smart enough to get into a football game with flares, you're probably smart enough to know you'll face severe fines and have to go through court if you actually end up letting off flares at the game. That's something that they need to contend with. Finally, we say that you can actually catch those provokers better because they under our system, because if they throw up a few flares or make racial slurs, then the rest won't react under our system, which means that these people will just be awkwardly led away by the police. Then we heard from their side that, well, you're going to be sabotaging, they're going to be rioters who'll sabotage other teams. First response to that is that the system is now at the discretion of the courts, right? So if they can identify that somebody has been consistently going to the Fulham matches all for the last few months, and then he suddenly goes to Tottenham and suddenly lets off a riot or something, then they're going to be punishing him, they're not going to be punishing the club. But secondly,
point of information.
The other people won't react to it under our system because they know that the punishment will accrue to their club if they do react to it. Finally, they said if it happens in the heat of the moment, it's unfair. Well, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, if you commit any crime, whether it's in cold blood or in hot blood, the punishment's the same.
Point of information. For your side, do you treat fans of sporting teams as crazy drunks or cold, rational creatures? And if you choose either, why?
We think that there is a variety of fans in sports, ladies and gentlemen. Some of them are crazy drunks who start the riots, and some of them, and the majority, are probably more rational fans who end up being led into the riots by those who provoke them. And what we do under our system is prevent both of them having an incentive to be involved in rioting. So now let's move on to why Team New Zealand's system of club accountability is so much more fairer than Team Singapore's. So firstly, on an individual level. So under the Singapore system right now, currently hooligan fans are inevitably never caught. So when the River Plate fans stormed onto the pitch when their team lost their place in the league on the last game of the season last year, the enormous flood of thousands of fans, most of them never got caught, and that's not justice. But even those few who did get caught didn't get properly punished because no one knew what they'd actually done because there were so many, because it's impossible to pick out who they are in the crowd. That's no justice. So what we have on New Zealand's system is we make those fans more accountable. Because those who get caught still continue to get punished, but it's actually easier to properly catch and punish them when there are far less fans who are involved in those riots, because you can actually identify who are the key ones and what exactly it is that they have done. What we heard from their side was, well, it hurts innocent fans. We think, firstly, that would be true only if this policy wasn't going to be effective. But we think we've quite conclusively proven to you that the numbers of riots and fan violence is going to be significantly diminished under our system. But secondly, we think that that is a sacrifice that we are willing to make to solve such an enormous problem. So when we're in ending things like the Vancouver riots, which destroyed so much of the city and millions of dollars in public property, when you're ending the sorts of racism that continues to occur, and when you're ending the connection to other crimes, which is what Thomas brought to you in the substantive and wasn't really responded to. We think that that's a good enough justification to continue this policy, even if it does sometimes hurt a few innocent fans. Finally, let's look at justice for the clubs. So what we heard from their side of the house was they don't actually commit the actual poor behaviour. But the fact of the matter is that the clubs contribute massively to their fans' behaviour. So the club Lazio has consistently condoned its fans provoking violence, and the Celtics haven't responded to the Celtics Rangers violence. What shows that even more, though, is that there are good clubs, like Arsenal and Fulham, who really, if ever, have violence. And because they really, if ever, have violence, then it shows that there is a potential for clubs to control this. And we think the team in Singapore need to engage with that. Finally, they said, well, these clubs aren't directly responsible for the problems. We think that, ladies and gentlemen, an important part of justice is deterrence, and you have to hold some stakeholder to account when it's otherwise failing. So, like, yes, we do hold companies to account for individual acts, like the fact is, like News of the World, for example, the whole company was punished, as well as like people like Rebecca Brooks in the company. They just don't seem to understand how the justice system works. So because we provided you with a just system, because we provided you with a system that solves the ongoing riots and problems in the sporting system, we're proud to propose.
I thank the third proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case of the opposition, I call upon Granta.
Before I begin, I'd just like to point out that Team New Zealand so far have failed to rebut our case on one very important point. Why it's double jeopardy for players who get insulted by their own fans, then have their career prospects dampened by the fact that their team is fined or take a hit in points. We think that forms a very significant proportion of their case, and because its propositions burden to prove a significant majority of cases, we think this alone is enough reason for them to lose this debate. But let's show you to three more areas. First, I'm going to ask whether Team New Zealand's policy really changes fans for the better. The answer is no. Secondly, does it change teams for the better? Answer is no. Finally, is it fair? The answer is still no. So let's go on to my first point. And here I have a little bit of a confession to make. I happen to be an Arsenal fan. And as you guys know, it's probably not a very good time to be an Arsenal fan, seeing as how we perform in the league. But the point is, even if Arsenal still keeps on doing so badly, I'm still going to support Arsenal because they play a type of football I find really attractive. It's the philosophy of the club, not how well the club performs in the leagues, that I subscribe to. And let me tell you, fans are like this. They don't subscribe to how the club performs in the league. They subscribe to a philosophy of the club. The racist fans of Rangers and Celtic subscribe to an image of the club that is purely Protestant or purely Catholic. They couldn't be bothered how well the club does in the league, so long as it is Protestant or so long as it is fully Catholic. So all their examples about incentivizing fans to turn against, this sort of racism doesn't make any sense. These racist and sectarian fans are still going to be racist and sectarian because they might as well see Rangers and Celtic do badly as long as this means they can force through their own sectarian agenda. No, no. The next thing I want to talk about fans is what fans are like when they begin racist and sectarian violence. At this point, fans are usually kind of drunk, sad, and depressed or angry. Kind of what I'm like after I watch an Arsenal football match on Saturday night. And the point is, these fans aren't likely to be having the sort of rational calculus Team New Zealand thinks they are. They aren't likely to be saying, in this moment, if I do this, this is going to damage my club really badly, mostly because they're kind of drunk. No. So that's what Team New Zealand kind of concede to when they say the people who start the riots are usually crazy drunks. These aren't the sort of rational people you can appeal to with the sort of policy Team New Zealand seems to be suggesting. So we tell you, no, they don't change fans for the better. Then they have this strange argument how, this is going to change fans for the better because all the teams are now suddenly going to start selling alcohol at higher prices. First of all, to punish the teams for selling alcohol at really low prices is like saying you lock up every single bartender in Dundee every time there's a crime in the city. People who sell alcohol aren't responsible for the crimes committed by those who drink from them. That's just completely absurd. Secondly, as I'm going to show you right now in my second point of contention, teams aren't actually going to change for the better. Why? Teams aren't going to change for the better because, as we've said from the beginning of this debate, teams already have all the incentive in the world to put in place the sort of things that both Team Singapore and Team New Zealand want. No team wants to be associated with crazy sectarian violence. Contrary to what they've been saying, Rangers and Celtic have come forward to beg their fans to stop this sectarian violence. The Rangers even appointed a manager from a different faith from the vast majority of the Rangers fan base just to point out to their fan base that this sectarian divide could be crossed. So teams are already taking the steps necessary to stop such crazy violence. Secondly, even if we concede that it's teams aren't doing these things, then isn't the solution just better regulation, to fine the teams for having alcohol put at too cheap a price, rather than to wait for a riot to break out before you fine the team at all. If Team New Zealand really is concerned about stopping the sort of riots, then you should punish teams even before riots occur by them not fairly complying with the regulations in the league, rather than after the riots happen and people have already been harmed. So this is why they won't change teams for the better. Then they came up with this really strange rebuttal to my second speaker's point. They said that courts will be able to tell whether you're a fan of one club or whether you're a fan of another club. Well, this doesn't really make sense considering what they've been saying for the vast majority of their case. A lot of their points hinged on the fact that it's impossible to isolate the individual fan who started the racist chanting or started the riots. But somehow now when it comes to our model, courts are miraculously able to determine who exactly it was that started the first racist chant or threw the first stone. This doesn't make any sense. We agree, sometimes courts make up these decisions horribly wrong all the time. And precisely because of that, fans are going to slip into the stadiums of opposing teams, cause havoc, and see the opposing team suffer. You create a massive perverse incentive for fans to do just that. That's my second speaker's point. We don't think they've managed to rebut this at all. Okay, go on. I'll take
Are you
it.
seriously saying the justice system doesn't have the ability to look at whether someone who posed as a Celtic fan bought tickets to Rangers' last 20 games and say that shows that he's a Rangers fan in fact?
Okay, so if the justice system can do that, then why can't the justice system simply isolate those individual fans who started the riots and then punish them, rather than punishing everybody like Team New Zealand suggested? Your entire first point rests on the basis that we must punish everybody because we can't catch the few. Now you're telling me you can catch the few? That's a clear contradiction. This undermines the linchpin of your entire case. No. But let's say, okay, we accept Team New Zealand's logic that you can't tell, who the individual fans who started all these things are. Does that still make it right for us to punish everybody? All because we can't catch a thief doesn't mean we lock up the entire village or fine the entire village. This just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense even more so in the case of clubs. And I'm going to demonstrate this in my third and final point of contention. Is this fair? Now, the first reason why we tell you this isn't fair is because clubs don't have control over who their fans are. Clubs don't go to every store and say, you can't buy an Arsenal t-shirt. You can't watch Arsenal play on television because we think you're racist. I mean, if Arsenal conducted a background check on me every time I turned on my television, I think I probably wouldn't be an Arsenal fan anymore. Clubs don't decide who their fans are in the same way that companies decide who their employees are. So it's completely unfair to blame clubs for the actions of people who they have no control over, who they may not even want to be affiliated with their club at all. Clubs don't want to be affiliated to these crazy racist ideologies. They've been saying that again and again. And it's not the fault of these clubs that, people who are racist happen to attach themselves to them. And even if clubs didn't do this, what about the clubs that do? Team New Zealand would punish everyone equally rather than those responsible for stoking racist violence. We think fundamentally that's not fair. The next point under this is this some strange argument that Team New Zealand brought up that somehow this is going to benefit all the fans because now I can take my little 8-year-old girl to games when previously I couldn't. First of all, we'd like to point out that Team New Zealand said in their opening speech, and we clearly agree, that the vast majority of football games, for instance, aren't violence. So we're only talking about a small minority of clubs here, of whom the majority fan base is largely law-abiding. So essentially you're punishing the entire majority fan base in these clubs, because suddenly the minority commit grievous crimes. Since the fans who commit these crimes are clearly in the minority, we think the majority supporters of the club are able to bring their children to these games most of the time. It's only in the select few instances where they can't. And you know what? Even if it did benefit the majority of their fans to be able to bring their friends and family to the game, is it alright to punish the club itself and the shareholder for this? No. We've said it before and we'll say it again. In the justice system, we know simply doesn't work this way. It might be a really good thing for society if we arrested everyone who lived in the same town as the person who committed the crime, because that means we definitely get the person who committed it. But is it fair? The answer is no. So because Team New Zealand's policy doesn't change fans for the better, because it doesn't change teams for the better, and most importantly, because it causes double jeopardy and is completely unfair, go with Team Singapore.
I thank the third opposition speaker for for his speech. We now move to the team's 4-minute including reply speeches, which the opposition will go first. There will be no points of information offered during the reply speeches. After 3 minutes, I will signal once like that to let the speaker know they've got 1 minute left, and at 4, a double bang, which shows the speaker that they should be wrapping up their remarks. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, I call upon Ashish.
Let's take a deep breath and calm down. I'm going to ask you two very simple questions. Is New Zealand's policy fair? And is it effective? Two very simple lenses through which I'm going to look at this debate. Let's first look at the question of fairness. It was a question Team New Zealand always seemed rather reluctant to talk about. They squeezed this massive point into 30 seconds of their first speech. But we brought it up again and we told you it was important and it had to be dealt with. We asked, when is it ever fair to punish the majority for the actions of the minority? They had no response. But late in the second speaker's speech, then they came back and tried to tell us, oh, but currently, many fans can't go along to these matches anyway because they're afraid that they'll be subject to this violence. We responded immediately. We said, that's just not true. Many fans do go down anyway and can enjoy these matches. They never responded. But if by their own logic, the worst form of punishment you can ever give to a fan is to punish their team, then they are conceding that they're punishing a vast majority of these innocent fans without any reason at all. That contradiction was something we pointed out from very early on in the debate, and was something we never dealt with all down to the very last speaker. So we think, on the point about whether or not it's fair for us to punish the majority, they never had a clear or a consistent response. But we also went further. We told you it was unfair to the clubs, because clubs can't choose their players. They tried to slip in a reply about, oh, clubs can because we can somehow screen everyone who comes in. We said that's not feasible, and they dropped the issue. We also had another point. We said, in the heat of the moment, what influence does a club have on the actions of its own fans? We said very often these people act in the heat of a moment. Again, they never had any proper response. But the biggest issue with regard to fairness that they refused to reply to was the issue of double jeopardy. From the very beginning, Team Singapore brought up that in a very significant proportion of cases, fans act in a way which damages their own team. They riot against their own team's performance. They said this never happens, so we gave them a couple of names. We talked about Mario Telly, we talked about Thierry Henry, we talked about Samuel Eto'o. We said all these people have been subject to abuse by their own fans, and then they never responded to this either. On the issue of fairness, they retreated and retreated and retreated, and at the end, they fell silent. Second issue, therefore, is it effective? From the very beginning, Team Singapore told you that in the present, there's a vast number of very strong incentives for clubs to prevent fans from engaging in such action. We told you that they would lose players if they let fans do this. We told you they would lose popularity if they let fans do this. We told you they might even lose funding if they let fans do this. All this affects the team's performance and its effectiveness on the field. Wales' analysis we brought up, which they never ever responded to. Their only response was, well, this is one other incentive we can put on the teams. But that wasn't enough. They had to show to us why this incentive was so significant compared to all the incentives that already existed, that this was going to substantially change their behaviour. And on that point of analysis, they never gave us a reply either. Then they told us that, in the end, that wait a minute, these people are rational. These people are going to be affected by our policies. So we gave them a point of information. We asked you, okay, are these people irrational or are they quite cold-blooded and calculative? They said, no, some of them are cold-blooded. Only those who riot are irrational. Wait a minute. That's exactly the point we were making. They made a massive concession in the third speaker, which Rinty pointed out, that they do believe these people are irrational. And if they are in fact irrational, what does your policy do therefore to dissuade these people? We even brought up a point about perverse incentives that their policy was going to create. We pointed out that if in the status quo these incentives were not going to work, then with their policy, the fact that it gave fans so much control over teams reverses the relationship in a way which is very dangerous and can let fans hold teams hostage to certain images which are harmful to the integrative identity of sport and to its importance in society. What therefore have I shown you? The policy punishes the majority for the actions of a minority, and it doesn't change behaviour. We are proud to stand today, and we oppose.
And now to conclude the debate for proposition and indeed the debate as a whole, I call upon Thomas.
Mr. Speaker, we show you very clearly that the reason fans riot, the reason they risk being punished themselves, is because they love their own club so much. The negative team's ideas then fell apart. In the face of this, people aren't going to want to riot when they know that the club they so love is punishment. We think that by altering the incentives, we create a situation where we can stop this violence, something that both sides of the House wanted today. So I'm going to look at two issues. Firstly, is this principally justified? And secondly, what are the results of the altered incentives? So firstly, the principal justification. We showed you very clearly at first that clubs often create the climate that leads to this sort of rioting and so on. They can do this in a number of ways. They can do it by irresponsibly providing alcohol, not screening fans. They can not police online message boards where fans post all these vitriolic comments. We showed you that also the players themselves often cause the violence, like the Russia versus Hungary water polo match that provoked the riots. We also told you that culpability would be based on how much action they were taking to prevent this. We think that it's a tragedy that they are not prepared to punish a club where there's a riot every week, where there's constant problems, and it's clear that they're creating a climate where they're not dealing with these issues. So then their only response to this was something out of a legal textbook about mens rea. However, we think that we already recognise that this doesn't stand absolutely. For example, we already prosecute for negligence. And then their response was, oh, this punishes others. We think that the people who are punished at the moment are those legitimate fans who want to enjoy matches but can't because of the fear of violence. So then they told us we can have regulation instead. Well, we think this doesn't work because it's not targeted where it's most needed. We think that those clubs where there's constant violence are going to be the ones where they have the incentive to create solutions to deal with this problem. We don't agree with the indiscriminate solution provided by their side. So then, as the debate went on, they kept talking about double jeopardy and how racism against your own team would be punished. We think that these tribunals would be robust, and it's the sort of thing they can deal with easily. So then, this next issue of what are the results of the altered incentives. We show you that clubs are going to take measures to actually prevent fans, because to prevent things like riots being created. Because they have this incentive, because they know they're culpable, they're going to act more responsibly, they're going to bar bad fans from their stadium, they're going to screen bags and do things like not provide liquor irresponsibly. We also showed you that fans love their club so much they want it to do well. We think that these people are going to not riot when they know that the club that they love so much is going to be punished for this. And the only response we had to this was essentially one of these people who are in Celtic do it because they're Catholics and not because they like the club. We think that if you're a Catholic, you go to church, you don't do it in a football club. So then the other thing they said, their increasingly obscurantist argument, was people will dress up in cross-dress in the kits of other clubs. We thought this was a ridiculous minor issue that didn't allow them to gain much ground. We showed you that fans have an incentive to report this sort of thing because they know their club would otherwise be punished, and also we think that this incentive already exists because if someone dresses up in a Manchester United shirt and they're an Arsenal fan and go and throw beer bottles on the field, that gets bad media coverage for that club. We think that this incentive already exists and it's not a problem currently. We don't think anything changes. The next point was that it allows fans to advocate racism. We think this is just an incentive to banish these bad fans we don't want. So because it leads to better results, it allows people to more enjoy the games because they know that it's not going to result in violence, because it alters the incentives we were proud to propose.
and eager to hear the results, but I think it's necessary for us to really thank our chair and the audience who's with us this evening, because of course you're all very important. We couldn't promote debate all over the world if it wasn't for the people who comes, helps, and really gets interest in this activity. So thank you. Second of all, I would like to really thank both of our teams, because this was a pretty passionate debate. It was a very funny one too. We had a lovely time watching it. I almost remember some of the football discussions we have in my country, who are quite passionate as well. But I'm very happy that this debate didn't end up like those discussions. So thank you for that. I hope we're all friends after the results as well. Okay, and going to debate, we thought that in terms of content and silent strategy, there wasn't that big of a difference between the two teams. We thought that both had really good strategies, were very organized, very structured in their speeches. So we thought it was a good debate, and it wasn't decided on those two factors. Although we thought that the Singapore team kind of looked slightly more convinced and more passionate about the subject than the New Zealand team in terms of style. We liked that very much. And in terms of content, we thought that the basic 3 points to decide this debate were: was this policy fair? For one side, the proposition team was trying to prove to us that even though it wasn't that fair, it was a sacrifice we were willing to make because of all the benefits. And from the opposition side, we heard that no, it's not a policy we're willing to take, because of course it's not fair to punish the majority for the crimes of the minority and all that. Then the second point we questioned ourselves was this policy going to be effective? We're actually we are going to actually make this behavior decrease. We were actually going to in some way contribute to stop violence. And in the third point, we analyzed if this policy, being fair or not, and being effective or not, had some benefits and some harms. Were more? Oh, sorry.
Can you not leave the building until you've spoken to me?
Okay. That's game. So there were more benefits than harms, or there were more harms than benefits. You have to remember that always in a policy motion, you have to prove the motion by telling us if the benefits are more than the harms or not, so if it's worth to actually take this policy. We thought that some of these points went to the proposition team, some of the other points went to the opposition team, so in the end we had to, as judges, value which were more important, and that's what decided the debate in the end. It was a split decision by 2-1, and the victory goes to New Zealand.